When I lost my pension, I asked to stay in their guest room temporarily. My daughter-in-law mocked, "Only if you clean, cook, and keep quiet." My son said nothing as she handed me a list like a servant. One morning I overheard her say, "He's just waiting to die." That night, I made one phone call that would turn her world. I stood in the hallway holding my suitcase, my knuckles white from gripping the handle too tight, and before I could even set foot inside what was supposed to be temporary shelter, Mile looked me up and down with that practiced smirk of hers and said, "You'll stay, but don't expect to be treated like a guest." She thrust a piece of paper into my hand, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light from the entryway chandelier. "Clean, cook, laundry, and stay out of the way." I looked past her shoulder at Darian, my own son, waiting for him to say something, anything, to tell his wife that his father deserved at least basic dignity, but he just stood there staring at his shoes like they were the most fascinating things in the world, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. That's when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake coming here, but what choice did I have? My pension was gone, vanished into some bureaucratic black hole I didn't understand, and at 68 years old with barely enough savings to last 2 months, I had nowhere else to turn. I'm a Leo Varan, and I've always been too damn stubborn for my own good, the kind of man who'd rather suffer in silence than admit I needed help, who built a career in civil engineering on the premise that I could control every variable if I just planned carefully enough. That pride, that refusal to accept that age and circumstance had made me dependent on others, it was eating me alive even as I stepped across that threshold into their suburban home. I'd spent my whole life being precise, being in control, measuring twice and cutting once, but somehow I'd ended up here, homeless in everything but name, at the mercy of a daughter-in-law who clearly despised me and a son who'd apparently lost his spine somewhere along the way to middle age. My flaw was thinking I could handle this arrangement, that I could bow my head and play servant in my son's house without it destroying whatever was left of my dignity, but I stepped inside anyway because the alternative was sleeping in my car, and even my pride had limits. The first week passed in a blur of menial tasks that made my engineering degrees feel like cruel jokes. I washed their dishes, scrubbed their floors, folded their laundry with hospital corners because old habits die hard, and ate my meals alone in the guest room after serving them dinner like some kind of live-in help. Mile watched me constantly, her dark eyes tracking every movement, correcting the way I arranged things in the pantry, pointing out spots I'd missed while mopping, reminding me that I was living in her house on her terms. "You missed a spot there, Elio," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness that barely concealed the contempt underneath. "And the towels need to be folded in thirds, not halves. I thought an engineer would understand basic geometry." Darian would sometimes wince at her comments but never defended me, just disappeared into his home office or suddenly remembered he had errands to run. And that cowardice hurt worse than Miles' barbs because this was my boy, the kid I'd raised, taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, and somewhere along the line he turned into this hollow version of a man who let his wife treat his father like garbage. Then came the morning that changed everything, though I didn't know it yet. I was wiping down the kitchen counter, my arthritic hands making the simple task take longer than it should have, when I heard Miles' voice drifting from the living room where she was on the phone with someone, probably one of her vapid friends from the country club. "Honestly, having him here is such a burden," she said, her voice casual like she was discussing the weather. "He's just waiting to die anyway. Might as well be useful while he takes up space." The sponge fell from my hand into the sink with a soft plop, and I stood there, frozen water running over my suddenly numb fingers, those words echoing in my head like a judge's gavel. Just waiting to die, might as well be useful. Something inside me shifted in that moment. Something that had been bending under the weight of humiliation suddenly snapped straight, and I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning humming overhead. That night I sat on the edge of the narrow guest bed, the mattress too soft for my back, staring at that damn list of chores Mile had given me, and for the first time in weeks I let myself really think instead of just surviving day to day. My hands weren't shaking anymore, my mind wasn't foggy with defeat, and I reached for my phone with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since before my pension disappeared. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed, a number I hadn't called in over a year, and I pressed dial before I could second-guess myself. The phone rang twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered. "Elio, that's you." It was Alton Reyes, 70 years old and sharp as ever, a former colleague who'd left engineering to practice law and who I'd worked with on municipal projects back when we were both young men who thought we could fix the world with blueprints and building codes. "Hello, Alton," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "It's time." There was a pause on the other end, then Alton's low chuckle that always reminded me of gravel in a cement mixer. "Wondered when you'd call," he said. "I did some preliminary digging after you mentioned your pension situation last month. We need to talk in person. Tomorrow work for you?" I glanced at the closed door of the guest room, hearing the television playing downstairs, Miles' high-pitched laugh cutting through the walls. "Tomorrow works perfectly," I told him. "I've got groceries to buy." The next morning I moved differently, with purpose instead of resignation, and when Mile handed me another list of tasks, this one longer than yesterday's, I took it without comment and even smiled slightly, which seemed to confuse her enough that she actually stepped back. I still cooked their breakfast, still cleaned up after they left for their respective jobs, Darian to his middle management position at some tech company, and Mile to her volunteer work that seemed to consist mostly of judging other people over expensive coffee, but now I was watching, really watching. I noted how Miles spoke to the landscaper with barely concealed contempt, how she called Darian an idiot under her breath when he forgot to pick up her dry cleaning, how she complained to her mother on speakerphone about how unfair life was that she had to deal with an elderly man in her house. Every word, every gesture, every casual cruelty got catalogued in my engineer's mind, filed away with the same precision I once used for load calculations and stress analyses. Around 2 in the afternoon, after finishing the mountain of laundry and scrubbing the guest bathroom until the grout practically sparkled, I grabbed my jacket and called out, going to get groceries, knowing full well that Mile was upstairs in her home gym on her Peloton bike, too focused on her own reflection to care what I did. I drove my old sedan across town to Alton's office, a modest suite in a building that had seen better decades, and found him waiting with a file folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. He looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, deep lines carved into his face, but his eyes were alert behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he gestured me to sit with the commanding presence of a man who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "Tell me everything," Alton said, settling into his chair with a slight grunt. "Start from when you first noticed problems with your pension." So I did, explaining how 6 months ago Darian had convinced me to consolidate my finances, said it would make things easier as I got older, help with tax planning and estate management, all very reasonable-sounding arguments that I'd been too trusting and too tired to question thoroughly. My flaw that blind trust in my own son had made me sign documents I barely read, transfer control of accounts I'd spent a lifetime building, and when the pension payment suddenly stopped coming 2 months ago, I'd been told there were complications, errors in the system, that it was being sorted out. But it wasn't being sorted out, was it? I asked Alton, though I already knew the answer from the grim set of his mouth. "No, Elio, it wasn't," Alton said, opening the folder and spreading papers across his desk like a dealer arranging cards. "Your pension was redirected. Funds were transferred to accounts that shouldn't have had access, and the authorization signatures, well, they're yours technically, but the circumstances under which they were obtained appear to constitute fraud." He pulled out a highlighted document and pointed to a date. "This transfer happened 2 days after you signed the consolidation papers." Same day Mile opened a new investment account under an LLC she created. Took me a while to trace the connections, but it's there if you know where to look. I stared at the papers, the numbers and legal language swimming before my eyes, and felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. "Darian was part of this?" I asked, needing to hear it confirmed even though I knew. "Not the architect from what I can tell," Alton said, his tone careful, clinical, "but complicit he had to be. Some of these documents required his signature as your financial power of attorney, which you granted him during the consolidation. Your daughter-in-law, though, she's the one who set this up. Smart about it too, layers of paperwork designed to look legitimate if anyone glanced at them quickly." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "Question is, what do you want to do about it? This could get ugly, Elio. Family lawsuits always do." I thought about Miles' smirk, about Darian's cowardice, about being told I was just waiting to die while being useful, and I felt no hesitation whatsoever. "I want every penny back," I said, "and I want them to understand exactly what they did." Over the next 3 weeks I fell into a strange double life that my engineering training made easy to compartmentalize. During the day I played the obedient houseguest, following Miles' increasingly petty demands with a bland compliance that seemed to embolden her to new heights of casual cruelty. "Elio, these glasses have water spots," she'd say, holding one up to the light like she was inspecting a diamond. "Do them again, all of them, or the vacuum lines in the carpet aren't straight." "Are you even trying?" I'd apologize, redo the work, keep my face neutral while my mind worked on other things, running through the legal strategy Alton and I were building piece by piece. My flaw, that stubborn pride, wanted to confront them immediately, to throw the evidence in their faces and watch them squirm, but Alton kept cautioning patience, reminding me that rushing would give them time to cover tracks, that we needed everything documented and airtight before making a move. In the afternoons, while Mile thought I was grocery shopping or running errands, I met with Alton, with a forensic accountant he'd brought in, with a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes, building a case that grew more damning with each discovery. We found not just the pension redirect but other financial irregularities, carefully hidden transfers that predated my consolidation agreement, suggesting this had been planned long before Darian presented me with his concerned son routine about making things easier for me. She's been bleeding you dry for months, the forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Dr. Patricia Langford, told me during one meeting, her fingers flying over spreadsheets. Small amounts at first, stuff you might not notice, then bigger chunks after you gave your son financial authority. Classic financial abuse of an elderly person textbook case. The phrase elderly person strung my pride even though I knew it was legally accurate, and I had to swallow hard before asking what our options were. Criminally, it's complicated, Alton explained. Proving intent beyond reasonable doubt is tough in family situations, but civilly, we can bury them. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, undue influence, conversion of assets. We can freeze their accounts, force asset disclosure, and most importantly, he paused for effect, we can go after the house. That got my attention fast. What about the house? I asked. Alton smiled, a predatory expression that reminded me why he'd been so successful in court. The house is still in your name, Elio. You transferred financial management to your son, but the deed never changed. You added them to the title as joint tenants with right of survivorship, sure, but you're still the primary owner. With evidence of fraud, we can argue their interest in the property was obtained through coercion and misrepresentation. We can force a sale, recover your assets, and leave them with nothing. The thought of Miles' face when she realized she'd lose her precious suburban showcase with the perfect landscaping and designer furniture made something dark and satisfied curl in my chest, and I knew I should probably feel guilty about that satisfaction, but I didn't. How long until we can move? I asked. 2 weeks, Alton said. We need to file the paperwork, serve them properly, and I want to make sure every I is dotted because she'll lawyer up the second she realizes what's happening. This needs to be airtight. So I went back to that house, back to cleaning and cooking and staying out of the way, and I waited with the patience I'd learned from decades of watching concrete cure and steel settle, knowing that timing was everything in construction and destruction alike. Mile grew bolder in her contempt, perhaps sensing that I'd become completely broken, a non-threat she could abuse at will. You know what your problem is, Elio, she said one evening while I was preparing dinner, her voice floating from where she sat at the kitchen island with a glass of wine. You never learned to adapt. The world changed and you stayed stuck in your ways, and now look at you, dependent on us, living off our charity because you couldn't even manage your own finances properly. I kept chopping vegetables, the knife making rhythmic sounds against the cutting board, and said nothing because anything I said would reveal the fury burning behind my ribs. Darian tried to help you, she continued, warming to her subject like she was rehearsing a speech. He begged you to modernize your accounts, to let professionals handle things, but you were too proud, and now here you are. That was rich, considering she was the professional who'd handled things right into her own pockets, but I just nodded and murmured, "You're right," because let her think she'd won, let her believe I was beaten, let her get comfortable in her false security. Darian walked in during this little monologue, home early from work, and I watched him flinch at his wife's words but still say nothing, just loosened his tie and asked what was for dinner like his father wasn't being verbally flayed 10 feet away. Ask your dad, Miles said sweetly. He's the help around here. The help, not family, not his father, the help. Darian's face flushed red, but he just muttered something about taking a shower and fled upstairs, and I wondered when exactly my son had become such a coward, whether it was a gradual thing or a sudden transformation, and whether I'd failed him somehow by not teaching him to stand up for what was right. The 12-year-old daughter Nessa, my granddaughter who I barely knew because Mile had always kept her at arm's length from me, watched these exchanges with disturbing quietness, her eyes too knowing for a kid her age. She'd caught me once putting away dishes after one of Miles' tirades and said softly, "She's mean to everyone, Grandpa, not just you." It was the first time she'd spoken directly to me in weeks, and I'd felt my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "It's okay, sweetheart," I'd told her. "I can handle it." Nessa had looked at me with those dark eyes that were so much like my late wife's it hurt and said, "I don't think you should have to handle it. It's not right." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say, and I'd had to turn away before she saw the tears I refused to let fall. Finally, after 3 weeks of documentation and legal preparation, Alton called me and said simply, "We are ready. File tomorrow, serve them by end of week. You should probably make arrangements to stay somewhere else because this is going to explode." I'd already rented a small apartment across town, a modest place but mine, paid for with money I'd been secretly moving to a new account. Alton had helped me set up legitimate funds that predated the consolidation and that I'd somehow overlooked myself enough for a few months of independence. "One more dinner," I told Alton. "I want one more dinner with them before the papers arrive." Alton was silent for a moment, then said, "You sure about that, Elite?" Might be easier to just leave, but I was sure, because some part of me needed them to see my face when I told them I knew what they'd done. Needed them to understand that the harmless old man they'd been abusing was anything but harmless. That final dinner was almost surreally normal at first. Roast chicken and vegetables that I'd prepared, while Mile complained about some minor social slight she'd suffered at her book club, Darian pushing food around his plate and checking his phone constantly, Nessa quiet and withdrawn like always. I served them refilled water glasses, played my role perfectly one last time, and then just as Mile was launching into another story about someone else's failings, I set down my napkin with deliberate precision and said, "I won't be doing this anymore." The table went silent, Mile's mouth hanging open mid-sentence, and I felt a savage satisfaction at the confusion on her face. "Excuse me," she said, her tone shifting from friendly chatter to ice in an instant. "What did you just say?" I met her eyes steadily, no longer looking away, no longer bowing my head in deference. "I said I won't be doing this anymore. The cooking, the cleaning, the servitude, I'm done." Darian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fork clattering against his plate. "Dad, what's gotten into you? Just finish dinner and we can talk about this later." But there was no later, not anymore, and I felt the words I'd been holding back for weeks pushing against my teeth like prisoners demanding release. "No, Darian, we'll talk about it now. Right now, because I've made some phone calls." Miles' face went through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion giving way to suspicion, suspicion hardening into defensiveness. "What kind of phone calls?" she demanded. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and I saw Nessa's eyes go wide with something that looked almost like hope. "To my attorney," I said, letting each word drop like a stone into still water. "About the theft of my pension, about the fraudulent transfers. About the fact that you've been systematically stealing from me for months, while making me into your personal servant." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, could hear Darian's sharp intake of breath, could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. "That's ridiculous," Miles said, but her voice had lost its confident edge, cracking slightly on the last syllable. "You don't know what you're talking about. Your pension problems are administrative errors, we told you that." I almost laughed at how quickly she'd shifted to defense mode, how the smug superiority had evaporated. "Really, because my attorney seems to think otherwise. He's been quite thorough actually, tracing financial records, interviewing people, getting expert analysis. Filed quite a comprehensive lawsuit this afternoon, matter of fact." Darian had gone pale, all the color draining from his face until he looked almost grey. "Dad, wait, you don't understand," he started, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "No, you wait," I said, and my voice came out harder than I'd intended, my stubborn pride finally getting its moment, my flaws bubbling to the surface. "You convinced me to trust you with my finances. You said you wanted to help to make things easier, and I believed you because you're my son, because despite your many failings I thought you had some basic decency left. But you let her," I pointed at Mile, "manipulate you into stealing from your own father. Do you understand what you've done? Not just legally, but morally." My voice was rising now, weeks of suppressed anger finally breaking through my careful control, and I knew I should stay calm but couldn't, my temper getting the better of my strategy. "We didn't steal anything," Miles shot back, standing up now too, her face flushed red. "We managed your money because you clearly couldn't do it yourself. You're older, Leo, and you were making terrible decisions, and someone needed to take control before you lost everything." The audacity of that statement, the sheer twisted logic of it, took my breath away for a second. "So you took control by taking my money," I said, "by redirecting my pension into accounts you created. By bleeding me dry and then making me into your servant in exchange for a roof over my head." Darian put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and I couldn't tell if he was crying or just trying to disappear. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he mumbled. "She said we were protecting you, helping you, I thought." "You thought wrong," I said, and some of my anger dissolved into something colder, more disappointed. "You know what hurts most? Not the money, not even the humiliation of these past weeks. It's that my own son, the boy I raised, could look me in the eye day after day while knowing what you'd done. That's the real theft here, Darian. You stole my trust, my dignity, my belief that family meant something." Nessa had tears running down her face, silent and still in her chair, and I felt a pang of guilt that she had to witness this destruction even though it was necessary. "I'm sorry you had to hear this, sweetheart," I said to her gently, "but sometimes adults do terrible things and there have to be consequences." Mile wasn't done though, her lawyer instincts or maybe just pure panic kicking in. "You can't prove any of this," she said, but her voice wavered. "It's your word against ours, and good luck finding anyone who will take the case of a confused elderly man against his own family." That was when I smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. "Already found someone," I said. "Alton Reyes, remember him, Darian? He was at your wedding, gave a toast about integrity and family. He's been very thorough in building our case. Forensic accountants, paper trails, expert witnesses. It's all documented, Mile. Every fraudulent transfer, every forged authorization, every penny you stole while convincing my son to betray me." "I want to see this evidence," Mile demanded, but her bravado was crumbling, her voice shrill now. "You're bluffing, you have nothing." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling to an email from Alton and turning the screen to face them. This is the filing. 23 pages detailing civil claims for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, financial elder abuse, and conversion of assets. You'll both be served with copies by end of week, along with a restraining order preventing either of you from accessing or moving any jointly held assets. I watched Darian's face as he read the words on the screen, watched comprehension dawn, followed by something that looked like pure terror. "Dad, please," he said, his voice breaking completely now. "We can fix this. We can pay you back, just don't do this." "Pay me back with what?" I asked. "The money you've already spent on this house renovation, the new car in the driveway, your wife's shopping habits." My pride made me want to keep twisting the knife, to watch them suffer the way they'd made me suffer, and I recognized this flaw in myself but couldn't quite stop. Besides, it's too late. Papers are filed. Wheels are in motion. Should have thought about consequences before you decided to rob your father. Miles slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump. "This house is in our name too. You can't just take it." And that's when I delivered the final blow, the piece of information I'd been saving, the one that would hurt most. "Actually, I can," I said calmly, putting my phone away. "The house is still primarily under my name. You were added as joint tenants, but I'm the original owner, and given the fraud involved in how you obtained your interest in the property, my attorney believes we have excellent grounds to force a sale and recover assets. So yes, Mile, I can absolutely take this house. In fact, I already have. Signed the listing agreement this afternoon. Property goes on market Monday." The room exploded then, both of them talking over each other. Miles screaming about lawyers and fights, and how she'd destroy me in court. Darian pleading and apologizing and promising things he couldn't possibly deliver. And through it all I just stood there watching the chaos I'd orchestrated with cold satisfaction. "You're insane," Miles shrieked, her composure completely gone now, mascara starting to run from tears of rage or fear or both. "We'll fight this, we'll prove you're mentally incompetent. No judge will believe a senile old man over his own family." That strung more than I wanted to admit, my pride recoiling from the accusation even though I knew it was desperate defense. "Call me whatever you want," I said, my voice tight with controlled fury. "Won't change the evidence, won't change what you did. Won't change the fact that I trusted you and you betrayed that trust for money." I looked at Darian, really looked at him, trying to find some trace of the boy I'd raised in this broken man before me. "I loved you," I said quietly. "Loved you more than anything, and you threw that away for her." Darian's face crumpled completely, and he started sobbing openly, ugly crying that shook his whole body. "I'm sorry," he gasped out between sobs. "I'm so sorry, Dad, I never wanted this. She said it was temporary, said we were just managing things I didn't understand, but I was already shaking my head, already done with excuses and rationalizations." "You understood enough," I said. "You're a grown man, Darian. You knew I wasn't getting my pension anymore. You saw her treating me like garbage in your house. You watched and said nothing and did nothing, and that makes you just as guilty as her." My own voice was rough with emotion now, my flaws showing through the cracks in my composure, the hurt father underneath the calculated avenger. "I wanted you to stand up for me, just once, but you never did." "Where will we go?" Mile asked suddenly, her tone shifting again, trying a different approach, vulnerability maybe, though it rang false. "If you sell the house, what are we supposed to do? We have a child, Elio, your granddaughter. You'd make her homeless." That was a low blow, dragging Nessa into this, and I felt my anger spike again, my temper flaring despite my attempts at control. "Don't you dare use that child as a shield," I snapped. "You're the ones who put her in this situation with your greed and your schemes. You could have been honest, could have asked for help if you needed money. Instead you stole from me and treated me like dirt. That's on you, not me." Nessa was still crying silently, and I wished I could spare her this, but some lessons could only be learned through pain. Picked up my coat from where I'd left it draped over a chair, a gesture I'd planned beforehand as my exit moment. "I'll be moved out by tomorrow," I said. "Already have an apartment. You'll get served with paperwork in the next few days, and I'd suggest you get your own attorney because this is going to get worse before it gets better." I started walking toward the door, my legs feeling weak beneath me despite my attempted dramatic exit, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and suppressed emotion. "Dad, please," Darian called after me, but I didn't turn around, didn't look back because I knew if I saw his face I might waver, and I couldn't afford to waver now. "We can talk about this," he shouted. "We can work something out." I paused at the door, hand on the knob, and said over my shoulder, "Talk to my lawyer. I'm done talking to you." And then I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the sound of Miles' curses and Darian's desperate pleas, and I sat in my car for 5 full minutes with my hands gripping the steering wheel, while my whole body shook with reaction to what I'd just done. My pride had gotten its moment of triumph, but underneath I felt hollow and sick because that was my son in there, my blood, and I'd just blown up his whole life even though he deserved it. I questioned myself in that moment, wondered if I'd gone too far, if my stubbornness and hurt feelings had made me cruel, but then I remembered Miles' voice saying I was just waiting to die, and the doubt crystallized back into resolve. The next weeks were exactly as ugly as Alton had predicted, maybe uglier because Mile hired an expensive attorney who threw every possible motion and objection at us trying to slow things down or find procedural errors to exploit. There were depositions where Miles' lawyer tried to paint me as mentally incompetent, where they brought up my age and suggested I was confused about events, but the forensic evidence was too solid, the paper trail too clear. Darian testified during his deposition, and watching the video later, I could see how broken he looked, how his attorney had to prompt him multiple times to answer questions, how he basically admitted to everything while trying to shift blame to not understanding what was happening. The judge was an older woman named Susan Brightwell, who reminded me of my late wife with her sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, and during a preliminary hearing she looked at the evidence and said flatly, "This appears to be textbook financial elder abuse. I'm granting the asset freeze and temporary restraining orders. Let's see where discovery takes us." Miles' accounts were frozen, along with any joint accounts with Darian, which basically meant they had no access to any money except whatever cash they had on hand. The house sale was approved by the court as necessary to recover assets, and within 3 weeks there was a sold sign in their yard, and Miles' carefully curated suburban dream was listed with a relocation company. I heard through Alton that Mile had moved in with her mother, that Darian was sleeping on a friend's couch, that they'd had to pull Nessa out of her private school and enroll her in public school, and I tried not to feel guilty about that, but couldn't quite manage it because that kid didn't deserve to suffer for her parents' crimes. My flaw was that I'd let my revenge impact an innocent child, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit, even though I told myself it was necessary consequences. The settlement negotiations were brutal, hours of back and forth between attorneys arguing about exact dollar amounts and liability percentages, and who owed what to whom. Mile wanted to fight it all the way to trial, wanted to drag it out and make it as painful as possible, but Darian broke first, agreed to settlement terms that basically admitted fault in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. The final agreement had them repaying everything they'd stolen plus interest and legal fees, which after the house sale proceeds and liquidating some of their other assets actually covered most of it. I got my pension restored, got control of all my accounts back, got enough money to live comfortably for whatever years I had left. They got bankruptcy and ruined credit, and the knowledge that their greed had destroyed their family. The day the settlement was finalized, Alton called me with congratulations and said, "You did it, Elio, you won." But it didn't feel like winning, sitting in my small apartment with my pension checks depositing properly again, knowing I'd never speak to my son again, knowing my granddaughter would grow up thinking of me as the grandfather who destroyed her parents' lives even if they deserved it. My pride had demanded this revenge. My stubborn refusal to be a victim had driven me to burn every bridge and salt the earth, and now I was alone with my victory feeling strangely empty. I'd proven I wasn't helpless, wasn't just an old man waiting to die, but the cost of that proof was every relationship that mattered to me. 3 months after the settlement, I was settling into my new routine in the seaside apartment I'd rented, a modest place with a view of the water from the small balcony, when I got a knock on the door. I opened it to find Nessa standing there with a backpack, her face uncertain and hopeful in equal measure. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "Mom said I could visit if you wanted. She's waiting in the car." I looked past her to see Miles' vehicle idling at the curb, saw my daughter-in-law's face through the windshield, and our eyes met for a long moment before she looked away. I turned back to Nessa, this child who'd been caught in adult warfare, and made a decision that maybe wasn't smart but felt necessary. "I'd like that very much, sweetheart," I said. "Come in." We spent the afternoon talking, carefully at first, then more openly as she relaxed. She told me about her new school, about how different everything was now, about how her parents fought constantly and her dad seemed sad all the time. "I know what they did was wrong," Nessa said at one point, her voice small. "Mom explained it all to me, about the money and the stealing. She cried a lot." I didn't know what to say to that, how to explain adult complexities to a 12-year-old, so I just said, "People make mistakes, sometimes very big ones. What matters is whether they learn and do better." Nessa looked at me with those knowing eyes and said, "Did you make mistakes too?" And I had to laugh because kids cut right through to the heart of things. "Yes," I admitted. "I let my pride and anger make me cruel when maybe I could have handled things differently. I don't regret making them face consequences, but I regret how much you got hurt in the process." When Mile picked Nessa up later, she actually got out of the car and walked to my door, something I hadn't expected. We stood there awkwardly for a moment before she said stiffly, "Thank you for seeing her. She's missed you." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement of something, and I found myself saying, "She can visit whenever she wants. She's welcome here." Mile nodded, started to turn away, then paused and said without looking at me, "I was wrong. about a lot of things. Doesn't fix anything, but you should know I understand that now." Then she walked back to her car and drove away, leaving me standing in my doorway feeling like maybe the story wasn't completely over, like maybe some things could be salvaged from the ruins I'd created. Life settled into a new normal over the next months, better in some ways than before, worse in others. I had my independence back, my financial security restored, my dignity no longer trampled daily. But I also had no relationship with my son who couldn't face me after what happened, no extended family gatherings, no grandparent moments except those carefully scheduled visits with Nessa. I'd won my revenge thoroughly and completely, and the cost was exactly what revenge always costs, everything that made the victory meaningful. My engineering training had taught me to calculate loads and stresses, but it hadn't prepared me for the weight of being right while being alone. One morning about 4 months after everything settled, I was sitting on my balcony drinking coffee and watching the ocean when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You taught him well, but not well enough." I stared at the message confused, my coffee going cold in my hand while I tried to figure out what it meant or who sent it. Before I could respond, a second message arrived. "We should talk about the rest of your assets." The cold feeling that spread through my chest was familiar now, the same sensation I'd felt when I'd first heard Miles' cruel words months ago, and I realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't over, that somewhere in my quest for revenge, I'd made new enemies or revealed vulnerabilities I hadn't considered. I called Alton immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed, my engineering mind already trying to calculate this new threat and coming up empty. "Got strange messages," I told him when he answered. "Someone knows about the settlement, about my assets." There was silence on the other end, then Alton's grave voice saying, "Forward them to me. Don't respond, we may have a problem." As I sent the messages and sat waiting for whatever came next, I realized that revenge was never clean, never final, that every action created reactions that rippled outward in ways you couldn't control or predict. I'd thought I was being clever, thought I was teaching a lesson and recovering what was mine, but maybe all I'd done was paint a target on my back for whoever was watching while I destroyed my family. The ocean kept crashing against the shore below my balcony, indifferent to human drama, and I sat there holding my phone wondering what fresh hell I'd accidentally summoned, and whether my stubborn pride had finally bitten off more than it could chew. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, sweet and cold, and precisely calculated like any good engineering project, but the aftermath was proving more complicated than any blueprint could have predicted. I'd taught my enemies a lesson about betraying me, but in doing so, I'd apparently advertised to the world that there were assets worth fighting over, and an old man who maybe wasn't quite as sharp as he thought he was. My flaw had always been underestimating complexity, thinking I could control every variable, and now I was discovering that human systems were messier than structural calculations, that you couldn't build revenge as cleanly as you could build bridges, because people were unpredictable and malicious in ways concrete and steel never were.